This is Ted Koob and welcome to my channel. So a while back I was researching about the mouse utopia experiment, if you know what that is, and I came across a blog post by a guy named Bruce G. Charlton, relating to the experiment. And I read it and I thought, gee, this is pretty based, pretty red-pilled. And so I went to his profile and I saw that he's written quite a lot of other things, this book included. And so I looked him up online, and I realized that he's basically not on YouTube at all. And his ideas and what he's written, I think, particularly in NRX circles, I think is pretty valuable. So I'm going to be reading his book to you. Pretty sure this breaks copyright law, but I'm going to do it regardless. So without further ado, here is Thought Prison by Bruce G. Charlton. Thought Prison: The Fundamental Nature of Political Correctness by Bruce G. Charlton. University of Buckingham Press, Buckingham, United Kingdom, 2011. Epigraph. This book is intended for normal, mainstream, secular, modern, disaffected, and alienated individuals, those who are complicit in political correctness, as are all intellectuals, but who are, when not distracted, drugged, or dreaming, in a state of despair. This book will, I hope, help such people to understand their condition and present the likely choices. It will not help them to save their world, too late for that, but it may help them to save their souls. Note: why I use the term political correctness instead of liberalism or socialism. The reasons include: 1. The confusion over what liberalism means. To some a free marketeer, to others a socialist. My definition of political correctness is broad and includes most mainstream conservatives, libertarians, and anarchists, who are nowadays all significantly politically correct. 2. Differences in usage between the UK and US. In the UK, the Liberals are a strange mixture of business and farming-friendly centrists with pacifist leftists of an upper-middle-class type. In the US, liberals are the furthest left of mainstream political ideologies. Number 3. That although PC clearly evolved from what is in the US called liberalism, PC is the outcome of a distinctive turn in leftist politics, which became obvious in the mid-1960s. In its striking, explicit, surface features, political correctness is something new under the sun, never before seen in history. 4. Leftist political groups have, over the years, called themselves communist, socialist, social democrat, liberal democrat, and various other names, but none of these have become dominant, and none are fully inclusive of leftism. 5. The dawning realization that the phenomena collected together under the jokey term political correctness was a vastly more robust and malignant thing than I have ever imagined. So what seemed either silly or trivial or both will end by destroying that modernity which made political correctness possible in the first place. Yet we can perceive now, in advance of all this, that even when political correctness is utterly swept away, it will be blind to what has happened and to what it had done. Political correctness will always see itself as being on the side of the angels, whatever its outcome may be. It is truly an amazing thing, this political correctness, something so paltry, so puny, so soft, yet wreaking such devastation while rendering the devastation imperceptible. It seemed, therefore, worth discussing under its new name as a phenomenon not truly new at its deepest level, but new in its combination of idealistic, delusional subjectivism with deadly, plotting bureaucracy. Blurb. What is political correctness? A thought prison, a self-constructed jail of delusions, yet a prison engaged in destroying itself, guards, and inmates together. This book seeks to explain the roots and depths of a phenomenon which is now the dominant ideology of the whole Western intellectual world. Political correctness is what most secular intellectuals have instead of a religion. Political correctness came from socialism, yet has in recent decades been embraced by the entire political mainstream, left, right, and center. Yet at the same time, political correctness is obvious nonsense, ridiculous, insane, self-loathing, and suicidal. How can political correctness be at the same time marginal and mainstream, ludicrous and mandatory, crazy and normal? Clearly, this is a phenomenon worthy of analysis. Bruce Charlton argues that political correctness is an objectively totalitarian ideology that has created an environment of fear among the intellectual leadership, with ranging from social ostracism through financial penalties and loss of employment, up to credible threats of violence and imprisonment. Consequently, Western elites have internalized the constraints of political correctness so that it lies, shabbiness and wickedness now permeate our very thought process. Biography. Bruce G. Charlton is visiting professor of theoretical medicine at the University of Buckingham. Bruce has an unusually broad intellectual experience. He graduated with honors from the Newcastle Medical School, took a doctorate at the Medical Research Council Neuroendocrinology Group, and did postgraduate training in both psychiatry and public health. He has held university lectureships in physiology, anatomy, epidemiology, and psychology, and holds a master's degree in English literature from Durham. Professor Charlton has published considerably more than 200 scientific papers and academic essays in these fields, and contributed to journalism to UK national broadsheets and weekly message magazines. Introduction. Political correctness, PC, is the dominant ideology of the Western intellectual world. PC is what the West has instead of a religion. PC is the political left in its origins and central constituency, yet it has in recent decades been embraced by the mainstream political right and center. Political correctness, therefore, represents the triumph of the left. Nonetheless, political correctness very obviously violates both common sense and logic, and is destructive of all that is good, beautiful, and true. So at one and the same time, PC is marginal and mainstream, ridiculous and mandatory, crazy and normal. This book explains how something so bizarre and wicked could be so ubiquitous and unremarkable. Political correctness obviously dominates its core territory of politics, public administration, the civil service, law, education, and especially the mass media. But PC also substantially shapes everything else: foreign policy, the military, policing, the economy, health services, and personal life, the mating game, friendships, and even family life. Therefore, political correctness is objectively totalitarian. Just as with the cruder totalitarianism of the mid-20th century, PC has created a population that lives in fear of being denounced and losing everything, fear of committing, or indeed merely being accused of, a thought crime or uttering a hate fact for which there is no defense, fear of the sanctions which range from social ostracism through loss of job, financial penalties, up to directed mob violence and imprisonment. Consequently, the mass of people, especially those of status with power and influence, have learned and internalized the constraints of political correctness, so that it is now something inside us, as well as pressing upon us. The lies, shabbiness, and wickedness of PC now permeate our very thought processes. As if in illustration, this book has no specific examples of political correctness. The reader must provide relevant instances from personal experience and unofficial knowledge. Anyone unable to do this would, anyway, be unmoved by my arguments. So political correctness is the ruling ideology of the West, and it is everywhere, so it cannot be attacked or overthrown without attacking and overthrowing pretty much everything. Political correctness is therefore the de facto, irrefutable, immovable, expansile in tendency, and yet, of course, as we all recognize, PC is self-destroying. Achievement of its aims is commonsensically incompatible with its own survival. Am I therefore suggesting that Western civilization is doomed? Yes, very probably it is doomed. Can anything be done to prevent this? Anything political, perhaps? No, I don't think so. So why am I bothering to write a book about it? The answer is simple, but it will strike most of my target audience of secular intellectuals as bizarre at best, nonsense at worst. The answer is so that some individuals may escape the general corruption and save their souls. Because PC is, more than anything else, destructive of the soul, proceeds indeed from the denial of the soul. And if you don't know what I mean by this, Read on. Political correctness is no longer a joke. When I first came across political correctness, which was in the summer of 1981, inflicted on me by a social worker, I thought it was a bad joke. Even in 1992, when I was in the Texas University Humanities Department for a month, and I saw the thing close up and in full flight, it still seemed too obviously silly to take seriously. Now, of course, the joke is on me. PC defines reality, and we all live and work at the whim of the advocates of PC, who could destroy the lives of any one of us at any moment, for any reason or for no reason whatsoever. And they would feel good about doing it. Escape from habituation into nihilism. Whence comes the sheer venom of PC? How is it that people who believe in nothing, or if they believe in anything, it is supposedly in tolerance, pacifism, relativism, social constructionism, stuff like that, how come these people are so vicious? And I think it is because they fear their own pleasurable distractions. Their lifestyle choices will be constrained or even taken away by the opponents of political correctness. And for the PC, pleasurable distraction is life itself. I say this without a shred of exaggeration. If you believe in nothing, if life can have no real objective meaning and all is socially constructed, then pleasure is absolutely necessary as an analgesic, and distraction is the primary philosophical argument. The politically correct are nihilists, that is, reality deniers, and when there is no reality, then the only positive is pleasure. Yet, is it really correct to say that the politically correct are nihilists, believing in nothing? Surely the opposite is true, that the most PC are precisely those who passionately believe in things like multiculturalism, diversity, equality, world peace, and so on. But the most PC really are nihilists in that they deny the reality of reality. For political correctness, there is no objective underlying reality. For PC, truth is a social construct, subjective, malleable, evolving. So PC does not discover truth, it makes truth, does not fit itself into reality, but creates reality via the shaping of discourse. Since nihilism is precisely the denial of truth and reality, then politically correct are certainly the nihilists by a strict and accurate definition. But all pleasures are up against habituation. On repetition, pleasures lose their effect. This is basic biology and unavoidable. Habituation is the driving force of modernity, the drive behind neophilia, love of the new, the drive behind fashion, the drive behind the leading edge of political correctness. Habituation rules because without effective stimuli, without perpetual novelty, modernity is lost, and without pleasurable distraction, modernity will be confronted by the void, and for a nihilist the void is no joke, but is indeed the only reality. For the nihilist, the real is an illusion, illusion the only reality, therefore to live is necessarily to be deluded. There is no truth, merely a choice between delusions, some more gratifying than others, some more altruistic than others. Unconstrained by unitary truth, the choice of realities, that is, of delusions, is potentially infinite. Political correctness is a process of deliberately self-induced delusion, ideally to the point of self-forgetting the act of choosing a delusion. Thus, the need for change, neophilia, which characterizes modernity, the need to constantly break boundaries, to transgress, always in search of novel, hence more powerful stimuli to connect us with the insubstantial world. Under modernity, humans are nearly all jaded by pleasures repeated. We are all decadent, all Caligulas now. So any who challenge the escalation of stimuli, the freedom to transgress, the primacy of the lifestyle, the mix of populations, the imagined possibility of the exotic, any who assert the eternal, the unchanging, who seek to limit the potential of the future even by word, especially by word, any who aim to ground life on truth, on reality, any and all such persons or groups strike at roots of vitality. And for the PC, vitality is all and only. Even as such a reactionary speaks, or is read, or watched, as he invades PC discourse, the politically correct can feel their life draining away, can sense the world receding, can perceive the delusional world crumbling, the void yawning. Hence the viciousness, the panicked attack using anything to hand which might work, ad hominem interventions, immediately believed as facts, fantasied motivations, lies of any and every kind, and even violence, at second hand, regretted maybe, but not condemned. For the PC, it is vitally necessary to control discourse, to exclude all hostile communications if possible, immediately to stop them if they break through. There can be no delay, effective dissent must be shouted down, mocked, vilified, shut up. The politically correct must switch off, turn away, gabble and gossip to drown or silence the hostile discourse, instruct, direct, and unleash the mob, then begin again to rebuild the thought prison of PC discourse by their own words in their own image. The venom of politically correct is the venom of a person faced by the extinction of those pleasurable distractions upon which they rely utterly to keep themselves going. The ever-expanding choice of favorite food, the anticipated holidays anywhere, the pleasures of seduction without restrictions, the unbounded potential novelties of sex, picking and mixing among unendingly growing, whirling, and recombining of cultures and ideas, the experimentation with drinks and maybe drugs, fantastic hopes for these to be facilitated by world peace, harmony, abolition of poverty, blendings, in sum, the infinite possibilities of the future, and the hope of pleasures so overwhelmingly and utterly absorbing as to extinguish all concerns concerning the meaninglessness or lack of purpose, strong enough to delete self-consciousness. The more extreme, the less realistic, the greater the delusional psychoticism of the PC dream, the greater its fragility and the greater the loathing of anyone who threatens to shatter it. Against such reactionaries, anything is permitted, restrained only by the danger of evoking such an extreme of self-disgust, of demoralization, as to shatter the dream oneself. This is the danger faced by the intellectual elite, that one day they will behave such that they will destroy their own delusions of themselves. Then there will be nowhere for them to turn. Nowhere at all. The irrationality of PC. Logic is extremely dangerous to political correctness, since its basic survival mechanism is one of continual revolution, continual attack, continual ground shifting. Logic, by contrast, presupposes an eternal and unchanging standard. Political correctness hates that kind of thing. Anyone who looks as if they might get PC to stay in one place and argue things out, fully and at leisure, without changing the subject, without descending into denunciation, is therefore exceedingly dangerous. PC, being psychotic, hence thought disordered, constituted by fragmentary and disconnected ideas linked only by a general trend, cannot argue rationally for anything longer than a soundbite segment. And if, by accident, PC starts arguing rationally and sustains this for more than a very short time, especially if the process begins to link one thing with another and action with consequence, then it simply stops being PC. When a thoroughly PC intellectual senses this happening, senses that he is being backed into a corner where he will need to engage in a properly rational discourse, or senses that the discussion is spreading into other fields and making connections, then, according to the rules of PC, anything is permitted if it enables escape from this emergency situation. Even violence. PC-sanctioned leftist or privileged minority gangs are allowed, indeed, tacitly encouraged, to shout down, intimidate, silence, assault, and if necessary, kill non-PC speakers or writers or organizers, to ensure that any dangerous process of sustained and connected interchange cannot get started, cannot be imposed on the public discourse. This pattern of coercively shutting down anti-PC voices has been repeated on college campuses and in public spaces innumerable times since PC began its dominance in the mid-1960s. It is forbidden for the politically correct to engage with the enemy. Any individual or organization which does engage with the enemies of PC will itself immediately and irrevocably be classified as an enemy of PC. The requirement to avoid rational engagement is not merely to avoid the risk of being out-argued or proved wrong. It is because rational debate itself cannot be allowed to happen. To discourse rationally is for a PC to die, on the spot. Imaginary enemies preferred. Since George Orwell, we have all understood the importance of enemies to progressive politics. Without enemies, the left cannot function, since it is based upon unending change, permanent revolution, and subversion and inversion, incessant destruction of the past and the fixed. Leftism is based on utter absorption in the battle of overcoming resistance to itself, and avoidance of any consideration about where all this is going and why. The left is all tactics and no strategy. The left has no strategy because for the left there is no reality. There is nothing that really matters out with human communications, no goal that is actual and stable, and no thing actual to aim for. By contrast, the reactionary religious right do not need enemies, since they believe in a reality and the good, and therefore have a real goal towards which they strive and which they really want to reach. If there are no enemies blocking the path to this goal, then so much the better. The religious right may, in practice, use enemies in much the same way as the left, but the right does not require enemies in order to substitute for a complete lack of strategy. On the one hand, political correctness needs enemies, yet on the other hand, never can engage with those enemies. The enemies serve a vital but purely symbolic function. Therefore, fantasy enemies are the best ones for PC, racist white nationalist organizations, for example. Such fictional groups have been constructed by the media over several decades, depicted frequently and repetitively in movies and TV programs, and continually referenced in the press and online. Drip, 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 inventions treated as facts. Creative depictions are treated as if they were real, immediate and terrifying threats, justifying perpetual consciousness-raising, continual suppression and distortion of important information, expansile rules and laws, insidious totalitarian repression, and a state of constant revolution. The enemies seem real, and that is enough. And the really great thing about fictional enemies, just like the compassion groups of PC, foreign ethnics, animals, the environment, is that they cannot talk back. Indeed, they cannot talk at all, except to say whatever you put into their mouths. Imaginary enemies are under control. Of course, there is a danger that fictional enemies will become real, and that the imaginary depictions will, sooner or later, put ideas into heads, and will attract people to fill the ready-made niche that PC propaganda has itself created. Real human, talking, and autonomously acting enemies occupying their most loathed and feared fantasy representations constitutes an ultimate nightmare for political correctness. Why is PC so shallow, flippant, and reckless? The short answer is because PC intellectuals do not think intellectual discourse is serious. And they do not think intellectual discourse is serious because they do not think anything is serious. Because they are relativistic nihilists, social constructivists, who do not believe in the eternal, unchangeable, objective nature of reality, and who will soon be dead anyway, so why bother? PC tactical retreats in the face of serious rational discourse. 1. Who knows? Nothing is certain. Subjective factors interfere everywhere. It is dangerous to claim certainly when none is to be had. Maybe you are correct, deep down, but as we never can know reality, then we will never know for sure. In the meantime, I might as well enjoy myself, or at least avoid unnecessary suffering. 2. Nothing is really real. Well, ultimately, nothing is real anyway, so whether you are more correct than I am doesn't really matter, because the universe is ultimately chaos, and any apparent order is just a random blip on the road to entropy. In the meantime, I might as well enjoy myself, or at least avoid unnecessary suffering. 3. It will last my time. Maybe you are correct, maybe my views will indeed lead to disaster, maybe currently promoted behavior is not sustainable or will destroy itself, but all that matters is that things keep going just long enough until I am gone. After all, when I am dead, I won't know anything about it either way. In the meantime, I might as well enjoy myself, or at least avoid unnecessary suffering. 4. Death will put an end to it. even if things do not last my time, even if things become awful, even if they become intolerable, since the immortal soul is a childish fiction, death will put an end to my misery, so I can always escape by killing myself. In the meantime, I might as well enjoy myself, or at least avoid unnecessary suffering. Atheism and nihilism therefore serve as a crutch to the politically correct elite. Political correctness, the intellectual elite, and the mass media. PC depends upon at least two necessary, although not sufficient, conditions: an intellectual ruling class and a large, effective mass media. The intellectual ruling elite are necessary because only they have the disposition for abstraction, the preference to regard ideas as realer than experience, because PC reality is socially constructed, and the tendency to privilege ideas even, or especially, when they are in conflict with common sense observation. The mass media are necessary because the media constitute the discourse, the cognitive process, the mode of thinking of modern societies. Political correctness is roughly a mixture of bureaucratic old left and subjective new left, the interspersion of a system of communist/Fabian totalitarian central planning with interruptions of countercultural hedonism. The main difference between the late Soviet Union in the Brezhnev era and political correctness in the West is therefore the presence of mass media. In the old Soviet Union, the media were instruments of state propaganda. They were dull, people didn't pay much attention to them, and the quantity of media output was anyway kept low because the media content was controlled and checked item by item. In the modern West, by contrast, the media are vast, primarily attention-grabbing and still growing. Media content is vivid and varied, and the subject matter is controlled only by self-censorship. The mass media and the memory hole. Modern Western humanity is addicted to the mass media for its near-infinite provision of attention-grabbing novelty, the stimulation of which provides vital distraction from awareness of the nihilistic void underlying mainstream secular discourse. The mass media is necessary to the dominance of political correctness, and itself defines the nature of modern discourse. Itself embodies and imposes the mode of thinking which enables political correctness. The way in which the media can put disapproved of news down the memory hole simply by refraining from mentioning it provides an important insight into the nature of modern discourse. Modern reality is only that which is in the media now. This is the price paid for so much media content of such an attention-grabbing ability. So much time is now expended by the addicted citizenry on acquiring news that each day the new news is poured in and the old news by this pushed out. When each day begins with the mind a clean slate, prepared and expecting to be written upon, then the media will control what is in people's minds, control the past, the present, and speculations about the future. To keep up with the flood of news, opinion, analysis, gossip, means that we must accord news priority over history, and the old can only survive by being continually remade as new. Even history is only real when it is made news. Old history is regarded as dull, obsolete, and most likely as evil and dangerous, since old history is never politically correct. Supposing someone was actually to believe it. This process is critical to modernity, because the media process is intrinsically devaluing of past people, opinions, and facts. This is indeed a key to the inversions of political correctness. The casual, routine, unargued assumption of the superiority of the current is an assumption which itself derives from the nihilism that reality is socially constructed, that the only reality, an aggregation of here and now mental contents. This pragmatic fact of modern life is critical to the ability of the PC elites to retain their claim to moral authority, because via the media, the intellectual class is able to continually to remake morality, truth, and aesthetics. What is current in the media is definitive. Sin can be made into virtue, virtue into sin, propaganda can be made into truth, truth into propaganda, beauty can be reframed as kitsch, and ugliness celebrated as beauty. When the only reality is subjective, and subjectivity is filled with the media, and the intellectual elites fill the media, than the intellectual class define reality. Fashion and PC. The characteristic modus operandi of political correctness is fashion. Fashion is not coercive, but everyone follows it, or at least everyone who matters. So fashion is harmonious. We all cooperate to make fashion, and we all do so as a result of, well, propaganda, I suppose. It is discourse, mostly the mass media, which informs and persuades people to follow fashion. People follow fashion merely to belong, but to follow fashion is to belong, and the only non-coercive sanction that is that if you do not follow fashion, then you do not belong. It all seems very mild, but it turns out that this combination of reward and sanction is sufficient under modern conditions to ensure the domination of fashion everywhere and in everything. So fashion is social harmonious, implemented non-coercively via discourse, and of course fashion provides novelty. Therefore, unlike traditional societies in which social harmony is static, often coercive and aspires to be eternal, and therefore has a tendency to be boring, fashion is dynamic and interesting because new and unfamiliar. When we begin to get sick of fashion and the novelty starts wearing off, fashion can either become more extreme in the same direction, or else a completely new fashion may be invented, or else a more or less forgotten old fashion can be revived but with some twist, or several old fashions can be recombined. Isn't fashion, therefore, an almost exact analogy for the world to which PC aspires? A world where everybody believes and wants the same thing, and so is harmonious and free from conflict and dangers, but also a world where the same thing is continually changing and evolving, and finally a world where all this is achieved potentially non-coercively by monopolistic control of discourse, of human communications. Old left, new left. Perhaps the new left 1960s counterculture would have happened even without a mass media to report and record it. Perhaps the children of the intellectual elite would still have rebelled against the dullness, boredom, and alienation of modernity, even if they were not being sympathetically shown rebelling on TV and in newspapers. But without the mass media, the student revolutionaries, tenured radicals, and crypto-communist fifth columnists would have no lasting influence on national life. Inchoate, hedonic rebellion is of itself fragmented, directionless, and unsustainable. It fizzles out. But as it happened, the mass media was there, and the new left did not fizzle out, but instead became integral to the mass media, which is to say that it became part of the West's cognitive processing. Of course, the new left cannot rationally be integrated with the old left. Visceral hedonism cannot be fused with bureaucracy. But they can be alternated in the human mind and in public discourse, and one can support the other. The old left bureaucracy is the basis and mechanism of governance, that which holds together modern society, that which allocates goods. But old left bureaucracy on its own is psychologically intolerable, a dull and demotivating machine that grows itself, but which is even less bearable for the bureaucrats than for their victims. The new left injected into this scenario countercultural but subjective qualities such as excitement, so especially sexual and otherwise transgressive, purpose, subversion, inversion, direction towards greater pleasure and less suffering, and variety, e.g. multiculturalism, the other. The new left made the old left interesting and aspiring and idealistic for officials, but at a cost. The cost of incoherence, fragmentation, delusional psychosis. What was necessary to sustain the new left countercultural spirit was that it became connected with old left bureaucracy. What was necessary to the old left organization was new left engagement. Result? Morally self-righteous bureaucracy. Feel-good committees plus hype. A definition of PC. Away from the mass media, the old left connection is intermittent and contradictory. In the mass media, the connection is apparent and harmonious. Nature of modern mass media. Some mistook the modern mass media for mere propaganda. It is indeed propaganda, but not merely. Some mistook the modern mass media for mere entertainment. It is indeed entertainment, but not merely. The old Eastern Bloc media were indeed merely propaganda, dull recitations of the party line, pure content. Parts of the Western media have indeed been mere entertainment, chewing gum for the eyes, pure form. But the characteristic, overall tendency of the Western mass media relates to both content and form, entertaining propaganda, and in truly vast quantities. The Western mass media consists of competing institutions which force it to become attention-grabbing and drive its continual expansion. The modern mass media is itself politically correct, staffed by the leftist intellectual elite, and also the virtual arena for the thrilling perpetual sham warfare of political correctness against its mostly fictional enemies. The battleground of PC against reaction is the mass media, and this battle is itself a major, perhaps the major, content of the mass media. So if it is asked, what exactly is it that the mass media propagandize for? What would be the best answer? The best answer is this, that mass media propagandize the battle between PC and reaction. The battle between, as depicted, on the one hand, open-ended possibility and an expanding variety of novel lifestyles, and on the other hand, dull, monochrome constraint, or put it more directly, the battle of universal compassion versus specific cruelty. And in this battle, the mass media is intrinsically on the side of PC, regardless of its specific content. The battle of compassionate and fun PC versus boring and cruel reaction is depicted in the headlines and fine texture of news and documentary, factual mass media content, but also in the fictional narrative content. And of course, these categories overlap. Much of the purported factual content is actually fictional, and much of the fictional stories and speculations actually being factual, where by being treated as implicitly fictional and speculative, they become grist to the media mill rather than triggering real-world responses. And since the fictional, or factional, is most memorable, then this is what is remembered, if indeed anything is remembered. In the end, there is a climate of made reality, socially constructed reality, the really real, eternal and changing, is not merely ignored and ridiculed, but rendered incomprehensible. The ever-changing hourly experience of the mass media is what defines lived actuality. Mass media as a social cognition. The modern mass media both coerces and trains elite intellectual discourse. It does this by content, but more importantly by form. It is the media that the modern intellectual elite has learned how to think, has learned how to alternate between old and new left, between a baseline of rational bureaucracy and frequent eruptions of unbounded utopian idealism, when to be rational and when to be passionate. The mass media disciplines intellectuals and organizations who endanger political correctness, disciplines first by exclusion, then by demonization, working like an inquisition by choosing and publicizing suitable anti-PC targets for aggression by the secular arm, organized leftist direct action, rioting by approved groups, apparently random acts by lone vigilantes, and so on. The mass media identifies and locates reactionary targets for legitimate aggression of many types, including violence. And since these reactionary targets are seen as having willfully provoked violence against themselves, the perpetrators of violence are exonerated from blame. The immunity of PC to reason. The fragmentary structure of the modern mass media itself shapes discourse. The underlying leftism of personnel and of our bureaucratic mechanisms, both are necessary, provides the default politically correct assumptions against which anti-PC intellectuals are required to prove their contentions. But the fragmentary cognitive process of the mass media bureaucracy alternating with countercultural idealism makes rational proof systematically impossible. The PC default is thus immune to any conceivable rational assault. Once political correctness has been established, then the psychotic cognitive process of the media ensure that it is insulated from challenge, insulated from reality. The modern intellectual elite are trained in this old, new left PC cognitive style by the media, aspirants to elite status are screened and evaluated primarily on their competence, reliability, and commitment to this mode of PC discourse, the ability to alternate bureaucratic proceduralism with eruptions of passionate, subjective conviction. Those aspiring to the PC elite are absolutely excluding from power if they are identified as being deficient in either aspect. So, the necessary source of the PC delusion is the modern mass media, but this is not sufficient. PC also requires an intellectual ruling elite, and not a military or practical or religious ruling elite, such as prevailed in all historical societies and prevails everywhere outside the developed world. PC depends on both the mass media and an intellectual elite. If either the mass media or the intellectual elite were removed, then PC would collapse. If the mass media were removed, then PC would collapse into Brezhnev-style centrally planned communism, which would collapse from dullness and demotivation among the bureaucrats. If the intellectual elite removed from power, then the self-sustaining abstractions of PC would be experience-tested, subject to common sense analysis, and would collapse into reactionary politics, theocracy, nationalism, or something akin to fascism. But, due to the thought prison inhabited by the politically correct, they do not recognize this mutual dependence. PC intellectuals are engaged in regulating, bureaucratizing, and thereby damaging the mass media. The mass media continually agitate to discredit, disrupt, and replace the ruling intellectual meritocracy. The impossibility of neutrality. Neutrality is a linchpin of elite political thought. Much of modern quasi-scientific social research is dedicated to demonstrating that some modern social system, law, education, the military, is not behaving neutrally. All that is required of such research is to show that, apparently superficially, similar people of different sex, ethnicity, or whatever are treated differently, then the system stands discredited and requiring radical reform. However, if it is actually impossible for an individual, an organization, or a culture to really be neutral, then this debate takes on a different complexion altogether, because if impartiality is unattainable, then the debate would not really be about failure to attain the ideal of neutrality, but actually a debate over who should be favored in situations that must be biased one way or another. The ideal of impartiality in social systems probably derived from the ideal of law, in which the same system is, supposedly ideally, applied to everyone. Everyone goes through the same basic process. The same idea applies to bureaucracies, as described by Max Weber, in which administrations are required to devise and apply procedures impartially, treating operationally similar cases as operationally identical. But in the real world, there are major differences in the application of both the law and of bureaucratic procedures, differences such as who counts in practice as operationally similar, who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, who has penalties enforced on them, what actually happens to punished people in practice, and so on. One classic political scenario nowadays involves someone, a radical, attacking a procedural system, such as the legal process, employment practice, or educational evaluations, as being biased against such and such a group, while someone else, a libertarian or mainstream secular conservative, defends the system as being impartial enough for the purposes. The radical pretends to argue that impartiality is attainable but requires change, while actually seeking privileges for a particular group. The libertarian/conservative concedes that absolute impartiality is desirable and that the present system is therefore deficient, but argues pragmatically that the system is good enough. The left stands for idealism and the right for pragmatism. Revealed as a mere pragmatist, the libertarian/conservative always therefore gives some ground in the direction the idealistic radical is pushing, in the direction of perfection, because any existing system is indeed imperfect, is indeed partial, at least, cannot be proven to be necessarily impartial. Hence, under PC, the existing, often historic evaluation system is always overturned and revised in favor of the groups about which the radical was complaining. That group which used to be the privileged is now suppressed, and vice versa. The proper question: who to favor? A truly reactionary perspective, by contrast, would accept the radicals' implicit assumption that one group or another must in reality be privileged, and would challenge the radical on the grounds of which group ought to be privileged. For example, if it is accepted that neutrality is impossible, then employment policy must favor either men or women. The proper question then becomes which is it best for employment policy to favor and on what grounds? For example, the organization of the military or care for young children will inevitably favor either men or women. The proper question to ask is, which is the most functionally appropriate favored group in each specific case? Clue: the correct answer is different for each of these two examples. When neutrality is rejected as impossible and undesirable, the focus of debate changes and becomes a matter of determining the basis for favoring. For instance, the left usually favors social justice, the secular right usually favors efficiency, and the religious right usually favors morality. One big advantage of acknowledging the inevitability of partiality is that this is what most people believe anyway and always have believed. In fact, it is only a minority of the intellectual elite, libertarians and secular conservatives, who really believe in impartiality as a desirable and attainable goal of social systems. But radicals, socialists, liberals, and corrupt politicians are simply exploiting the failure to attain impartiality as a justification for imposing a revolutionary inversion of values. Hence, a belief in the ideal of neutrality unwittingly serves a radical and nihilistically destructive agenda, since it actually leads to partiality in the opposite direction from that which is socially functional. Assuming neutrality is impossible. Let us suppose that neutrality really is in practice impossible. Just suppose that for a minute. I am personally very reluctant to admit this. I still find myself habitually defending the ideal of neutrality, even though after having seen through it. But anyway, just suppose impartiality is an illusion, and it really is always a choice between favoring one option or the other. And naturally there will be degrees of favoring, but suppose that a significant degree of favoring really is inevitable. Then, if true, this supposition would be a blow struck at the very core of rationalism, of modernity, of enlightenment, of philosophical discourse, of science. It would be to admit that we have been deluded for centuries, that we have been barking up entirely the wrong tree, that we have been rendering our civilization helpless in the face of its opponents, worse, making our civilization abet its own downfall. Just this simple error, merely to suppose neutrality, impartiality of process, really was a possibility, and further that it really was desirable, instead of the fact, as it seems, that always we must make a choice. Maybe it was this critical flaw in Western assumptions which led to our self-immolation. Good causes and good intentions. It is necessary to recognize that political correctness is not well-intentioned, that it is merely obsessively self-justifying, and that this is not at all the same thing as having good intentions. Obviously, we are in a situation where explicit intentions are disconnected from observable outcomes. Yet, since modernity broke apart the moral universes of motivation and action, of faith and works, it cannot put Humpty together again. Political correctness therefore can find no satisfactory basis for moral action. PC is therefore amoral, which actually means immoral. The moral universe of PC subsists on two distinct realities, good causes and good intentions, but never the twain can stay stuck together. Note the lack of references to good outcomes. Being wholly abstract, PC is indifferent to outcomes. Outcomes are regarded as having no autonomous reality, but are merely seen as part of abstract theory. A collection of PC-approved acts confronts the individual, and it is up to him to manufacture his own subjective motivations for doing or not doing these acts, and pass them off to himself and others as convincingly as possible. Or else he starts with his motivations, his sympathies and desires, and manufactures more or less plausible symbolic acts by which these motivations are supposedly implemented, and it is up to the intellectual elite to manufacture some more or less plausible evidence that these acts flow from these motivations and are, or have potential to be, effective in the real world. Somehow, motivations and hopes never add up to a morally cohesive world of acts. Acts are continually being reframed and reinterpreted by the ever-changing and incoherent abstract interpretation. When everything is interpretation, action is rendered hazardous, indeed unnecessary. The bureaucrat and the media communicator, those who do nothing and risk nothing, but who interpret and reinterpret reality for the masses, are the modern cultural exemplars, certainly not the heroic producer, maker, actor, and doer, whose positive behaviors might, at any moment, be reinterpreted, and the erstwhile hero exposed as a modern villain. So, wretched insert submissiveness oscillates with arrogant but empty moral grandstanding. The moral exemplar of PC ethics. Since progress is defined in terms of leaving behind, the good is that which has left behind the wicked is that which has been left behind by the movement of progress. The wicked are those people who resist the movement toward perfection. If being left behind is due to ignorance or incompetence, then that is okay, tolerated, even indulged and made the object of missionary work, consciousness raising. But if being left behind is willful, if being left behind is a matter of refusing and resisting the next step in the march of moral progress, then this is reaction. Which is useful for political correctness, because hatred for the informed and willful reactionary is its main underpinning motivation. Hatred of reaction is what gets PC out of bed on cold winter mornings. Under a system of PC, here and now in the West, the individual must adjust and adjust, again and again, to the widening wave of socially defined progress, of moral denial, extrapolation, and inversion. Such repeated and unending adjustments is the individual's non-negotiable moral duty as a responsible adult member of the ruling elite. So, the essence of PC morality is to keep up with the moral progress, to match one's inner motivation with the changing nature of socially approved action, i.e., socially approved by the ruling elite. The moral exemplar, the hero of PC ethics, is he who convincingly stated motivations are slightly ahead of the current state of socially sanctioned actions, perceptibly advanced, further along in the direction that social progress is trending. Nice work if you can get it. Is anybody safe? Under PC, whatever you do, whatever willing you show, status is contingent. There is no safety even for members of the ruling elite in a system of political correctness. Anyone at all is susceptible to denunciation for any reason or no reason at any time. Since PC is a wave of moral progress, which leaves behind all previous moral standards and behaviors, there can be no accumulation of moral capital. This applies to the ultra-PC just as much to the openly reactionary. In this respect, PC is more like a communist than fascist totalitarianism. Under fascism, membership of and courageous loyalty to the in-group usually brings safety from denunciation, but under communism, anyone who is vulnerable to denunciation, friends and enemies of the government alternated with bewildering rapidity. Nobody was safe. Indeed, the PC elite seem especially vulnerable to denunciation. Since they are under continuous scrutiny, is it hard to keep up with the pace of change, and the change is so arbitrary, it is very difficult to suppress common sense 24/7. The highest member of the PC elite is only a single gaffe away from disaster. Note, a gaffe is when an elite PC intellectual momentarily forgets to lie. Under political correctness, you are only as good as today's match between your motivations and the ever-changing societal symbols of virtue. PC assumes that, as an elite intellectual, your motivations are bad unless proven good, and motivations cannot be proven. You may advertise your good motivations relentlessly, daily, hourly, but you cannot ever prove conclusively against hostile skepticism that you are deep down and overall a fully PC, hence decent, person. Not least because it is very unlikely that you are a decent person. After all, who is? All of this means that a politically correct social diktat can, from whatever cause, such as an elite competition, the need for a scapegoat, or the whim of the media, arbitrarily decide at any time to stop giving you the benefit of the intrinsic doubt, and then you will be helpless, isolated, stripped of all moral status, a marked man, a legitimate target of self-righteous aggression. Because after all, you are guilty. Everybody is. And scapegoats are sometimes necessary. Tough luck that it happened to be you. Safety for victim group members. For the intellectual elite, there is no safety. The only security is to be a member, a representative member, of an indulged group, that is, a victim group, a group which is a targeted beneficiary of PC. And even then you are vulnerable to denunciation by a higher status victim group. Victim group members can do more or less what they like, so long as they do not encroach on other victim groups, and it is up to PC masters to make excuses for them and to find the support to enable them to continue. As an indulged victim group member, your actions and motivations are tolerated and forgiven almost without limit. Indeed, it is a test of PC that this be so. The degree of PC moral status within the elite correlates closely with the degree of tolerance that you accord to victim groups. When tolerance becomes self-threatening quasi-suicidal license, we have entered the realms of PC sainthood. PC saints are those well-meaning people martyred in pursuit of PC-approved activities, such as idealistic aid workers who choose to devote their lives specifically to assisting societies that are devoted to training anti-Western activists, and who, being Westerners, are captured by these anti-Western activists and continue to support the anti-Western activists even in captivity, even under torment, even unto death, and so on. To be truly, madly, deeply PC is to die for one's delusions, to accept suffering and to expire at the hands of those on whose behalf one has risked all. Life as a supervised game. But the news is not all good for victim group members, because as a PC-indulged victim you lack moral responsibility, which means you are treated as a child or an imbecile. Kindly treated, no doubt. Nonetheless, to be regarded as a species of incompetent can sometimes be a source of friction. Exactly because you are not to blame for what you think or do, you are regarded as a victim of circumstances, and therefore you are not, and never can be, a moral agent or exemplar in your own right, but only as a representative of your victim group. You are tolerated, with affection or with irritation, but you are not admired. Because you are merely existing, you are regarded as special. Therefore anything that you personally might think or do is automatically invalidated, rendered invisible. As a member of an indulged victim group, your thoughts and behaviors are bracketed, encapsulated, set apart from that progressive moral actuality which is the preserve of the PC intellectual elite, an elite who patronize you in both senses of the word, in that they are your patrons who subsidize you, and that they treat you in a parental fashion as if you were a child. Patrons expect beneficiaries to be grateful. However, it has commonly been observed that patrons are in fact always hated. Do a man a good turn, and he will have an enemy for life. The patronized will not rest until they have expunged their sense of dependent gratitude in the cleansing act of biting off the hand that has been stroking and feeding them. To be a member of a victim group under PC is to be a perpetual moral incompetent, susceptible to tantrums, not responsible for your actions, unfree, a product of uncontrollable impulse and overwhelming environment, an acted upon object, not a determining subject. You may be flattered by praise, as teachers praise the efforts of a toddler. Who's a clever boy, then? But under PC you are not, and never can be, one of the teachers. But how can PC intellectuals square this with the demands of the victim groups and with their own guilty consciences? By converting ever more of life into supervised games. In a contrived context of make-believe, but only in that context, it is possible both to be an indulged victim and at the same time act like one of the teachers. So education, public administration, the legal system, all become supervised games run by PC adults who allocate important jobs to the kids. They make the kids prefects, milk monitors, team captains, and the adults hope that none of the kids will ever notice that they don't get to be headmaster. What matters most, PC or societal function? Originally, the PC elite covertly recognized that since these supervised games, education, public administration, law, the arts, mainstream religion, are merely make-believe optional extras, the real business of life must go on elsewhere. The police, the military, the economy, science and technology all remained under PC elite control. At most, the victim groups would be used as window dressing, puppets, or mouthpieces. Well, that was then. However, since the PC elite do not believe in reality, therefore they do not believe in truth, so they lie all the time, because it is expedient, lie to themselves and lie to each other, as well as to outsiders. So of course by now they have long since lost sight of what they originally knew, that the system can only carry on if make-believe supervised games are not allowed to interfere with the serious stuff, the vital frontline social functions, the police, the military, the economy, and science and technology. Nowadays, the PC elite have entered the realms of delusional psychosis. Inside their thought prison, they just assume that the important stuff will happen automatically and without attention or need for tough long-term choices. Indeed, will not just happen but grow forever despite the imposition of PC priorities and their enforcement as being more important than primary social functions. Excuses are not tolerated for PC failures, while failures of primary function are softened, hidden, and magicked away with public relations spin. The military might be excused losing wars, the police might fail to prevent serious crime or fail to control riots, terrorists may slay at will, unemployment and inflation might both rise, science and technological breakthroughs might dry up, but none of this is none of it matters so long as all social institutions become ever more PC, more diverse, more environmentally friendly, and so on. Science and technology will, it is assumed, continue to provide breakthroughs, the economy will continue to expand by increased productivity, the police will maintain public order, indeed, since people will have PC attitudes, and there will be less need for police, the military will keep us safe indeed, since PC will make us better people, we will not have so many enemies. Individuals will be forgiven pathetic ineffectiveness, gross inefficiency, neglect, incompetence, dishonesty, violence, corruption, fraud, abuse, forgiven absolutely anything except transgressions of the primary PC taboos. For political correctness, the necessary stuff just happens naturally, spontaneously. But the important stuff is done to us, done for us, by the elite PC supervisors. Political correctness is now the primary reality unto which everything without exception must be fitted. Virtue in political correctness equals altruism, unselfishness. Political correctness is a secular ideology based on moral principle. It has its own conception of virtue. From a secular perspective, the highest virtue, and perhaps the only virtue, is altruism, helping others at cost to oneself. Other forms of human cooperation are disvalued. Altruistic cooperation is regarded as the primary virtue. Altruism is contrasted with the opposite vice of selfishness. Altruism is unselfishness. But ideally, altruism must be pure, which means an altruism untainted by any possibility of selfishness, which means altruism untainted by any degree of personal advantage, untainted, therefore, even by pleasure. PC morality is essentially altruism, and the highest altruism is disinterested. From an otherworldly religious perspective, altruism is a subordinate virtue. There are other more important things than helping others in a material sense, but from a secular perspective, unselfish altruism is primary and frames almost the whole of moral discourse. PC altruism can therefore be seen as objectification of Christian charity. Charity/agape is an individual chosen expression of love. By contrast, PC altruism is a coercive, measurable, procedural transfer of quantifiable goods. Most or all forms of naturally occurring altruism in biology are, in fact, merely indirect forms of self-interest. For example, altruism towards relatives promotes one's own genes. Altruism towards allies brings cooperative benefits. You scratch my back, then I'll scratch yours. Some instances of apparent biological altruism are merely selfish long-termism, while others are genetic self-interest coming into conflict with the interest of a specific organism, when an individual bee risks her life to make more likely the survival of the extended family in the hive. Even the altruism of Christianity is conceptualized by political correctness as being tainted and corruption by the desire for heavenly happiness. So, from a PC perspective, Christians are merely, albeit it is assumed delusionally, selfishly sacrificing themselves in this world in order to gain more happiness in the next. In fact, a Christian life is better understood as transformative, a change in perspective from worldly to heavenly, a moving towards communion with God. But of course, all that kind of thing is just nonsense, manipulative nonsense, to political correctness. Altruism marks an important cleavage point between leftist PC and right-wing secular conservatism, libertarianism, and reaction. For the secular right, the reality that altruism is tainted with selfishness is accepted. Indeed, it is embraced as a means to the end of greater functional effectiveness. For the secular right, selfishness is not exactly good, but, as noted by Adam Smith, is regarded as potentially leading to good under a competitive system of natural selection such as market economics. But this attitude strikes the left as merely amounting to a complacently cruel acceptance of suffering, indeed an attitude of greed is good, promoting human selfishness, hence the worst conceivable wickedness for PC. Political correctness recognizes that the secular right has no conception of original sin and regards human beings as intrinsically but blamelessly selfish, e.g., because evolved from selfish ancestors. The secular right accepts that kin selection means that humans tend to favor their families, that people with common interests will spontaneously make alliances for their own benefit, that individuals will always be prone to corruption by selfishness, hedonism, and short-termism, and the secular right simply tolerates these problems so long as things, on the whole, are working well, or when eradicating a specific abuse seems likely to cause more problems than it solves. On principles, materialistic pragmatism is therefore basic to the secular political right, i.e., the tendency to accept and work with human sin. And this is precisely why leftists, including the PC, feel morally superior to conservatives and libertarians. Disinterested altruism and moral superiority. Disinterested altruism is the reason why the politically correct left feel themselves to be virtuous, feel themselves to be morally superior to the right, feel, indeed, morally superior to all previous forms of human morality, including all religions, because the PC ideal is to be aiming at the unselfish material, hence measurable, good of others without any personal reward whatsoever. Naturally, the individual PC person always will, indeed, always must, fail to attain this ideal. Naturally, individual humans always fail to be impersonally altruistic. They can't help it. But this merely emphasizes that individual selfishness is original sin for the PC, and the implication is that as an ideal, individuals ought to be and need to be subordinated to impersonal mechanisms for coercively implementing altruism at the social level, regardless of the consequences. In fact, PC is a logical response to the ultimate problem of altruism regarded as the primary moral value, the psychological paradox that if being altruistic makes you happy, then you are being rewarded, therefore you are not really being altruistic, but merely self-indulgent. If you help others because you enjoy helping others, then your altruism is not pure. But for PC, others ought to be treated altruistically, whatever your feelings on the matter may happen to be. To be pure, altruism therefore should not make you happy, should leave you unmoved at least, and preferably should make you miserable, but you do it anyway. Only if altruism makes you suffer can you be sure that you are not merely doing it for your own selfish motives. For PC, coercive altruism is a higher morality than voluntary charity precisely because it yields no personal gratification. Indeed, underlying PC is the notion that charitable people do not deserve the feelings of satisfaction associated with charitable giving, since they had no right in the first place to possession of the goods which they are allocating. Coercive altruism is also seen as intrinsically more dependable as a basis for provision of goods, since voluntary charity can be withdrawn. Suppose people stop enjoying helping others, or come to believe that a particular others do not deserve much help, what then? Better make the process mandatory and procedural. In reality, voluntary charity is usually more effective and coercive altruism may not be more dependable, but for PC the facts are irrelevant. The superiority of coercive altruism is moral and intrinsic, therefore not a matter for empirical evaluation. The answer is that, as an individual, you should be made to be altruistic, and should be made miserable by your imposed altruism, and that this situation is abstractly good because then your own motivations will have nothing to do with your behavior. This, then, is altruism which does not rely on the purity of human motivations. Your job, in a system of PC, is therefore to resign yourself to suffering, not to enjoy it, but not to complain about it either. Simply submit to it. Willing but unhappy submissions to coercive altruism is therefore the key concept. For the idealistic PC individual, The ultimate ethical act is willingly to submit to being forced to be altruistic, not because you enjoy the process, but because you believe that submission to altruism is the highest value in an ultimate and abstract sense. The best possible job for a PC individual is therefore to work for a coercive bureaucracy that does altruistic good, to hate your job, and to do it anyway. As PC is itself an abstract system at its purest level, the satisfactions of PC are, naturally, themselves equally abstract. The insanity of pure abstract altruism. Pure disinterested altruism, imposed on by all abstract systems, is therefore a logical consequence of the moral primacy of pure altruism. It is also insane, and lacks any test in reality. PC is good by definition, and for no other reason, especially not because PC has been found to be good. What is more, PC is the creation of that minority of humans capable of abstract thought and who regard abstraction as primary and experience as derived from theory. The perspective is coercively enforced on that majority of humans who privilege experience above extraction, e.g., the majority of who spontaneously privilege natural law above moral inversion, beauty above shock, truth above subversion, and so on. The mass majority therefore experience coercive altruism as merely alienating, either as aggressive or patronizing depending on whether they are at the moment givers or receivers. PC stands or falls by the fact of a secular intellectual ruling elite, and can be imposed widely by this elite only by the recent technologies of modern mass media. And PC is only possible in a fully materialist and secular society, where this worldly goods and their just, i.e. altruistic, allocation can assume ultimate importance, overriding all other considerations, such as the saving of souls. It is this idealistic quest for pure impersonal abstract altruism in a secular context which has caused the anti-human, alienating, aggressive, patronizing, self-hating, and suicidal insanity that is political correctness. Immune to evidence. It is vital to understand that political correctness is immune to evidence, and I do not mean resistant to evidence, nor do I mean blindly dogmatic such that PC requires an overwhelming weight of evidence to be convinced, but I mean utterly and completely immune to evidence such that unanimity of incontrovertible evidence against PC is still insufficient to induce significant re-evaluation. This is important to realize, since it makes clear that time, energy, and personal resources expended on trying to convince PC advocates with evidence is just so much time and energy down the drain and lost, precious resources that could potentially have been expended constructively elsewhere. The reason that PC is absolutely evidence-proof is that it operates at a wholly abstract level. But the reason that it superficially appears that PC might potentially be open to evidential refutation is that, although abstract, PC is concerned exclusively with material proxy measures of its abstractions. That is the distinctive move which set apart PC from any preceding ideology. Political correctness operates on the assumption that an abstract system of allocation is intrinsically superior to the lack of such a system, and the details can be worked out in the fullness of time. The reason why politically correct people believe in objective moral progress is that moral progress is equated with systematic altruism. It is not so much that PC individuals believe themselves to be personally morally superior to everyone who has ever existed in past human generations, although in practice they often do, but that in past generations lacked abstract mechanisms for altruistic allocation of goods and they were therefore intrinsically inferior. For the sincerely PC, a world containing the United Nations, the European Union, and affirmative action programs is intrinsically superior to any and all previous human societies which lacked such institutions. My point is not that abstract systematic altruism is a means to some kind of end, but is an end in itself. This is why effectiveness is of no interest, outcomes are of no concern, and evidence has no relevance. Indifference to outcomes. Political correctness is utterly indifferent to what happens to human beings, and I do not mean relatively insensitive to the consequences of its policies, but utterly indifferent. Nothing which actually happens can ever challenge the ultimate virtue of political correctness, because PC regards systems as moral, not choices nor outcomes. Choice exists only to be manipulated or compelled, Outcomes are of interest merely to provide stimulus to introduce abstract allocative systems. This is why evidence has no effect whatsoever. After all, PC policies are always introduced in the teeth of common sense and without any coherent reason to believe they would lead to good outcomes. Why then should evidence accumulated after their implementation in any way affect their continuation? My point is that political correctness has now reached such a level of abstraction that no evidence could ever challenge it. Reform is impossible on principle. That means that those who oppose political correctness should not, need not, waste time and energy on rational arguments with people who are truly PC. There is no way into the thought prison of sincere PC, no possibility of modifying or moderating its basic nature. Political correctness can only be accepted or ignored, obeyed or replaced. Takeover by the PC elite, 10 summary points. 1. Abstraction. People of high intelligence have a tendency to think abstractly rather than instinctively. Note: abstraction is also productive of nihilism, i.e., to the belief that there is no ultimate reality. If abstraction is regarded as providing the deepest access to reality, and since the power of abstraction depends on the vicissitudes of human mental functioning, then to the abstracting mind all is intangible, changeable, disconnected from spontaneity, from common sense, from emotional underpinning. To the compulsively abstracting intellectual, reality tends to be perceived as dependent on the thinking mind, a solipsistic play of shadows, momentary distractions, meaningless sufferings, and equally meaningless pleasures. Abstraction is indeed very useful in some situations in some societies, but it is like a mental pathology in other circumstances. Indeed, it is probably best to regard a strong disposition to abstraction as primarily a mental pathology, but one which has some useful specific functions, e.g., mathematics, science, invention, in certain types of society. 2. Secularization. Loss of belief in the ultimate nature of reality as transcendent, immaterial, and otherworldly. A focus on this world, specifically 1. The measurable, and 2. The subjective, which are fused, the subjective rendered measurable by proxy. 3. Abstract materialism. The combination of abstraction and secularization leads to an elite world view which is materialistic, this-worldly, and which explains things in terms of abstract forces and dispositions. 4. Spirituality of materialism. The purest, most idealistic morality from this perspective is therefore an abstract but non-transcendent spirituality of the material. Note: a clear early example is Marxism, which is all about economics, about the production and distribution of material goods. Yet at the same time, material production and distribution is explained abstractly and linked with a spirituality. The end result is that in Marxism the matter of the production and distribution of material goods becomes the highest level of human moral concern. Marxism was the first large-scale morality of altruism, in which altruism was made abstract and involuntary, in replacement for the earlier personal and voluntary noblesse oblige, charitable almsgiving, and philanthropy. So, Marxism therefore removed virtue from the individual and from the realm of choice, and made morality a socially imposed abstract process. Under pure Marxism there were no good individuals, only the good society. 5. Psychological goods. Political correctness extends a concern with the production and distribution of material goods to include the production and allocation of psychological goods, so that PC is concerned by such matters as happiness, suffering, respect, and self-respect, mostly status. 6. Operational definitions. However, since PC is materialist, intangible psychological factors require operational definition in terms of material proxy measures, so that happiness/suffering may be equated with income and wealth, or with the results of surveys such as happiness ratings or crime levels, or with measures of health. Status is operationally equated with occupancy of certain jobs, or attendance at certain specific educational establishments, or possession of educational certificates, and so on. Therefore, the abstract spirituality of materialism is underpinned by concrete operational measures of a material nature, such that the monitoring, prediction, and manipulation of these material measures is equated with the intangible psychological states in which they are taken to be causally correlated. Note: following the pattern of Marxism, in political correctness there are no good individuals and no good individual choices or decision, but in contrast with Marxism, neither is there a good society, since only impersonal and mandatory procedures or mechanisms of allocation can be morally good. Immoral individuals are such for the necessarily selfish defiance of impartial allocative procedure, which resistance is seen to open up catastrophic possibilities of disaster, chaos, corruption. Such individuals are guilty not for what they actually do, nor for the actual consequences of their actions, but for their failure to submit to objective and involuntary process. 7. Intellectual meritocracy. All societies are meritocratic to a degree, although the nature of the merit varies. For instance, merit may be military prowess for a man, beauty for a woman, and the rapidity of meritocratic sorting, i.e., social mobility, varies, sometimes a few years, sometimes a few generations. Throughout the 20th century, merit became equated with the intellectual ability and attainment, and a society developed in which the intellectual elite were the ruling class. Almost all the main social functions therefore became dominated by intellectually selected personnel, but especially public administration, education, and the mass media, the means of public discourse and communication. Intellectual meritocracy allowed the pathology of abstraction to operate unchecked at the highest levels of social organization, expanding and changing without effective feedback from common sense and spontaneity. 8. Bureaucracy. Also throughout the 20th century, there was a massive expansion in the bureaucracy, the employment of almost all intellectuals within bureaucracies, and the linkage of all bureaucracies with public administration. So the modern society became interconnected by a bureaucratic web of laws, regulations, subsidies, and coercive sanctions. And these bureaucracies became less personal, with all major decisions being taken by a committee and by vote. 9. Mass media growth. The mass media also grew to occupy ever more of the time and attention of the population. 10. PC dominant. So by the late 20th century, the massively interconnected bureaucracy and mass media meant that, for the first time, the intellectual meritocratic elite could impose their distinctive morality on the rest of the population, and political correctness was established. A positive feedback loop was established, by which the monopolistic PC reality created by the intellectual elite fed the abstract secular psychology of the same intellectual elite. The elite both made and experienced only that which was politically correct, and the circuit was closed. PC was then detached from instinct, spontaneity, and experience. Cut off from normal human psychology, common sense, and protected from contradictory evidence, the hermetically sealed system of PC expanded rapidly from the mid-1960s, intellectual elite amplifying the influence of PC, PC amplifying the influence of intellectual elite.